is Dr. Uma Chakravarti. She is, as all of you know, and perhaps have read this card, we have given a detail somewhat of her background, but she teaches history at Miranda House, College for Women, University of Delhi. She's the author of The Social Dimensions of Early Buddhism, a co-author of The Delhi Rise, 3 Days in the Life of a Nation, and is author of Rewriting History, The Life and Times of Pandita Ramabai. Dr. Chakravarti is associated with the women's movement and democratic rights movements in India. She's been with the Institute of Women's Studies in Lahore from its inception and is a regular faculty member, so regular that most people think that she's a Pakistani. She's a member of the People's Union for Democratic Rights and has participated in many joint fact-finding teams dealing with problems of communalism, women's rights and agrarian struggles. She has been involved in numerous campaigns undertaken by the women's movement and has tried to create a safe campus for women. Apart from the books that I've already mentioned, she has written extensively on gender, caste and labor. Today, Dr. Chakravarti will be speaking on, and the title of the paper is Rescripting the Past, Inserting Women into History. Dr. Chakravarti.
I was invited by a publisher to prepare for the millennium a volume which was going to be an illustrated history of the ancient India. And initially I was a little bit hesitant, but I got quite excited at the idea that I could now, in a sense, even put together a set of visuals which would try and redress the kind which is known as the three bend. You know, you sort of stand like this, and that's the kind of way in which you visualize women. And there's a lot of women in sculptures. And as I went along, she sort of began to get a hang of what I was saying, and she said, this happened the first time, it happened the second time, and I said, I'm not going to allow the biases of the past to go into the new millennium. So I'm looking for women who are laboring, I'm looking for women who are, in the various arenas in which women actually do participate, but who nevertheless have, even in art forms, been restricted to this extremely bounded personality. So after a while she said to me, she got a hang of what I was saying, and she said, are you one of those strident feminists? And I said to her, yes, a feminist, just a feminist. And I wanted her to understand that the term strident was something that she had just added, because there's nothing I had said in the course of this which suggested that I was strident. I was simply trying to redress the balance of biases that we had lived with. And I think there is a moral in this story, because in this anecdote, because in a sense what we're still battling after 25 years of trying to, in the women's movement, of trying to sort of put women, get them out of the marginalized position that they are, you could still be taken for someone who is in some way fixed into a trope. That is, if you're a feminist, you can't be just a feminist. You have to be something that goes along with that. And that is what, in a sense, trashes the whole feminist agenda. Now, this is basically going to, the more I think about it, the more important it is to actually deal with history. I'm a historian, so, I can do nothing except really look at my field. Unlike Christine, who can deal with both history and sociology, I can only actually deal with history, and I'm going to stick with that. And I'm going to try and tell you how history has been, how women have tried to rewrite history, which is why it's called rescripting the past, because we already have a script, and we basically have to now rescript it. Now, it's not that women were the only sets of people who were marginalized in conventional history. History has archetypally been the subject which dealt with the story of power. No other subject is so loaded as history is, because the self-consciousness of those who tried to leave behind even the sources has been so there's been a very self-conscious agenda in the historians, even in the craft as well as in the material. So you find that poor people, marginalized people, tribals, indigenous peoples who have actually had themselves conquered have not left their stories behind. They've not left their histories behind. And women share that. Women are among the muted groups because women have not wielded power. The only occasional woman that you might get creeping into the history books are women who have some way stepped out of that domain where you step into that field of power and in a sense have illicitly used power, because hardly anyone in the world has inherited the throne if she had a brother. So most women, that's the only woman who did that was Razia, and I think it's actually something interesting because we forget that. Razia is the only one who inherited the throne, even though Razia Sultana, even though she had brothers. That is, her father thought she was more capable than her brothers. But by and large, women step in if they have brothers, or women step in sometimes to simply enter the field and this is regarded as entering a field which is not entitled to them. So you have, pejorative terms like petticoat government and kitchen cabinet and so on, which actually load this kind of bias. But essentially then, because it was the story of power and the struggles for power, women got left out. What we have had to do in the subcontinent to some extent is something slightly different. That is, as the women's movement proceeded, we've actually had to deal with the discussion to some extent of women in history, particularly in tradition. But this is a constructed history roughly in the 19th century when, under the colonial encounter, many scholars felt, many men felt that they had to rehabilitate their past and tended to kind of look for a romantic golden age in which you tried to then find women figures who would give you the impression that actually patriarchy did not exist in the ancient past. Now, one of the things we've had to do is to actually rewrite that history, because even that history is a biased history. Even though women are visible, it's a biased history, and one has had to uncover the histories of suppression or the histories of visibilization in a sectoral kind of way. Now, women's history in India and perhaps in the world, in fact, all over the world, has actually been something that is directly attributed and linked with the emergence of the women's movement. That is, we do not have systematic women's history till the movements began across many parts of the world. And in South Asia too, you'll find that essentially the rewriting of history by feminist scholars is very closely linked to the women's movement. This is true even, and this is the point it's worth thinking about, that even when history began to be rewritten no longer with the political focus, which it did under Marxist influence, under the whole phenomenon of what is called social history. Social history then became the history of social processes. And even in these social processes, it was gendered because women never figured. It was considered that if you had transformation, if you had change, the experience of this change was the same for men and for women. So you had modes of production, you had social relations being talked about with social formations, but you did not actually understand whether there was a gendered nature to the development, to the experience of these social changes. And it is only then with the women's movement that this actually started. Now I want to make a point here which I think is worth us thinking about. History or no discipline gives in to its traditional biases unless there are struggles and people's struggles. People may not rewrite history, but it is people's struggles that led to agrarian struggles, peasant struggles, workers' struggles, which led to actually things like the subaltern history at all. It is, you respond, scholars respond, scholars do not actually change their biases till you are forced to recognize that you are doing something unfair. And this is exactly what happened as far as women's history is concerned. It is the women's movement which actually created the impetus for looking at history once more, and it is from there that we begin to get the rewriting of history. There were basically, I think, two major agendas were proceeded with by feminist scholars working in the field of history. One was they had to and they usually began with historiography. They first tried to understand why history had been written the way it had, and you looked at the writings on women where they did feature and tried to find out why they were featuring in the way in which they did. So, for instance, the 19th century constructions of the glorious woman who lived supposedly in the Vedic times is one of the things that had to be disaggregated, because you had to basically look at why that kind of history was written when it was. And I think in similar ways, the historiography itself was the first field that women explored. Then they went on to actually trying to insert women into history, and they did this in a somewhat in ways which were you did supplementary history or you did complementary history. You said, well, this is what men were doing, and then this is what women were doing as they went along. Quite often this was quite unsatisfactory, but nevertheless it has created a body of information that we have. The second thing that feminist historians have done, which is very important, is to address the problem of the biases of our sources themselves. So you can't go too far with the phenomenon of complementary history, because essentially sources are things that have come down to us, and the sources are things that have already experienced the bias of their own times. So, for instance, you do not get the story of slaves. You don't know, I mean, slaves had not left their records. Women, therefore, also have not left their records. They haven't actually left the corpus of their writing, or it appeared that they had not left this. And so, consequently, the task of the historian was that made doubly difficult because our sources were already refracted. So, how far can you go then? You have to do things like read against the grain. You have to look at what the men are saying, and then you have to say, why are they so hysterical about something? And we have Manu in India, in the archetypal, let's say, biased individual, both on the level of caste and on the level of gender. And now Manu keeps on talking quite obsessively about women and how they have to be disciplined. So then you have to kind of read against the grain. Now you're not going to get anything sympathetic to women in Manu's text, but then you have to then read against the grain. Now this too was not satisfactory. So women then had to actually look for something which was quite extraordinary, which is they had to construct an archive of lost works or an archive of marginalized works. And this was fairly exciting. Now, what I'm going to do today for the rest of the 10 or 15 minutes that I have is to actually look at this archive, the alternative material that women have excavated, going back to fairly ancient times. This is textual material, and in these texts, the kind of issues that are coming up, it is important from the point of view of looking at the kinds of issues women were talking about even as far back as the 6th century BC. Now there is a text called the Therigatha. It's a Buddhist text. It's a text compiled, it's a text which comprises the verses that women who joined the Buddhist Sangha, the Buddhist monastic order, these are verses that are attributed, these are verses that they are said to have uttered. And what is striking is, and this is a very early text, it would go back to roughly, let's say, about 3rd century BC. Now, the text is unusual because there is another text which is called the Theravada, which is the male monks. So the male monks also composed verses, but these verses were it's a separate text, and that itself is quite interesting. And then if you look at the kind of metaphors and the kind of experiences that the two categories of people describe, they are strikingly different. Now, the men, and I'm not going to go into the details about the men, maybe it will come up in the question, but I do want to talk about what women are talking about in this, and that is one good reason to say that despite the fact that the canon would have been formed, certainly men would, because the Sangha was also a biased space, and so men had control over women, even there, authority over women. Even though it may have the intervention of men, the kind of experiences that women are talking about are so reflective of women's social experience that the authenticity of the material is something that gets established by the very nature of the material itself. Now, among the things that women do speak about over there is that the life that they are expected to lead, domesticity, is not the beginning and the end of their existences. Now, this is actually quite extraordinary, and I want to make a strong point about this. Those of us who live in South Asia, feminists, are often dismissed because we are told that we are getting our agenda from the West. This is rubbish. This is the worst kind of travesty that you can have, because the women's movements in South Asia have organically grown from the social contradictions in their own respective soils. Of course we have solidarity, of course we share across the globe, but it isn't as if to say we understand our oppression in any terms except those that have given rise to those contradictions. And this text is important because it tells you that women in the 3rd century BC in this region are already saying domesticity is not the beginning and the end of life. So here's a consciousness which is not this very different from the kind of consciousness that is the beginning point of many feminist quests. And it is there. So it's a very important text for simply to demolish even this false notion that the feminist issue, that we have a unique culture, we treat our women uniquely, and therefore we don't, all of the stuff that comes from is coming from outside, it's distorting our cultures. That is something that's put paid to by simply looking at the Theravada. Now, they talk about the fact that they're not wanting to be stuck with what they call the kitchen drudgery. They actually talk about the silbatta, and the silbatta is the life that is seen of a woman, that is the pestle and the mortar. And there are verses over here which are marvelous because they describe a woman sitting under a tree and meditating, and Mara, the devil, the negative feature, the person who comes, he tests her by saying, what are you doing sitting under this tree and meditating? You need only what is two-finger consciousness. And what is two-finger consciousness? Now, this is not something that a man could have thought of. It is the ability to test whether the rice is cooked or not. You put the rice grain in your hand and you say, this is cooked. Two-finger consciousness. So he's telling her, what do you want except this two-finger consciousness? And she turns around and says, what do I have to do with that kind of life? I want space. And the word she uses is okasha, akash. I want the space. So she's looking for the sky. Now, this is a kind of formulation that cannot arise except from the experiences of women. And this is another important aspect of the whole business of knowledge making as far as women are concerned. Subjective experience should be the basis of knowledge. It's a subject, I mean, where you understand, you start with your own, with your own experiences. Subjective experience is a perfectly legitimate basis for knowledge. And you get this over here. You have another wonderful, wonderful set of verses. Now, this is ascribed to a slave woman called Punya. Punya literally means little. So you're actually making her into, it's not that she was a girl necessarily, but she's being treated as a girl because, you know, she's owned. Now, Puya goes down, she's a woman who fetches water from the river for her master's household. And she spends a lot of time doing this. It's cold, and she goes there to fetch the water, and she sees a Brahmin man standing in the water, shivering as he takes his dip, as he takes his ritual dip. So she says to this person, she said, "What, you know, I have to come here because my master and mistress will beat me if I don't come and collect this water. What makes you come here and stand here and shiver in this water, you know, making these dips?" And he says, "Well, I do this because I'm trying to wash off my sins and I'm trying to accumulate merit. I'm getting merit." It's, you know, it's a sort of, it's a metaphor that recurs in later writing. And she says, now it's interesting. Again, it's a very commonsensical formulation. It has no abstract dimension to it. Puya says, but if you are accumulating merit by taking this dip, then it means that all these frogs and the fishes and the crocodiles, they're all going straight to heaven. And if you're accumulating merit and washing off, then what makes you, you know, if you're washing off the sins, then what makes you so sure that you're going to not also wash off whatever merit you have? I mean, what is the logic by which the water is going to discern that you have got, this is a sin, knock it off, this is a merit, keep it going? You know, I mean, it's incredible. And of course, you know, the Brahmin is quite struck by her formulation. But again, what is fascinating is the very formulation. It is again common sense. It's basically common sense. And it's doing so many things simultaneously. Critiquing male knowledge, critiquing Brahmanical knowledge, you know, it's fascinating. And it continues to have the same kind of arguments comes up again in Sufi poetry. Exactly this kind of thing. So you see how, I mean, the text itself, therefore, is rich in producing this kind of material. Now, I want to quickly jump to the 20th century. It's not that there isn't other material, but I'll leave it for the moment. Perhaps I should tell you one more anecdote, especially because, not anecdote, it's a historical it is historically grounded, it's in a text. Then, you know, part of the thing about looking back into the past is to romanticize it. And especially if men are telling that story, they will always tell you half the story, they won't tell you the whole, because the whole could be a little bit dislocating. Now, as part of this 19th century construction, the 19th century reformer in parts of South Asia basically went back to the text and found figures that they thought they could use in their arguments against, in their agenda for women's education. Essentially, now men decide. They decide you don't want to be educated, and they will push you back. They will decide when they want you to be educated because then you have a new agenda. This is what is happening in the 19th century, because now men feel that they are embarrassed if they have wives who cannot discuss literature with them. So, you know, obviously it has to be then you have to give them a certain amount of opening. And in the 19th century, this is what they're doing. But in order to break their own taboos, they have to now extract figures from the ancient past, which will show you how wonderful they are. So Gargi was this philosopher. We all heard about this fantastic Gargi, who's a philosopher. And they said, look, she's a philosopher, fine. But they didn't tell us that she was only one. She was supposed to have engaged in a debate with a very well-known male philosopher who has been canonized. In fact, a lot of knowledge has been associated with him. Now, she's only one among 6 people who actually disputes him. So already that is a gendered situation, even in the very ancient past. Besides which, the end of the story is really problematic. Now, she is really quite, she knows her material, she knows her philosophy, and she's pushing Yagnvalkya repeatedly. She's asking him more and more complicated questions. Now, she gets to a point where she asks him 2 subtle questions, and she said, if you answer this, then I'll accept that you are really a great philosopher. And she asks these questions. And then, when we looked at the text, we didn't know the story at all. You found that he couldn't answer the question, so he said, shut up, woman, otherwise your head will break into pieces. That was the end of the debate. There was no debate. That's it. You see. Now, this part of the story is not told because in the 19th century, social reformer has to address patriarchies existing even then. You see, and you just want to tell a partial story. So, feminist historians have had to go and find that kind of material out. Now, anyway, nevertheless, the 19th century there has been this very important moment in the lives of a lot of women. The 19th century, despite the diatribe I was making against education, see, there was this moment now where barred knowledge, that is knowledge which was now, women were barred from it and the lower castes were barred from it. For the first time, through the print revolution, does begin to become more accessible, especially when you have husbands who are telling their wives to go and read and write. And they do that. What is interesting is some men don't tell their wives to write, but they still learn to write. They secretly learn to write. And the first autobiography in India, perhaps in South Asia, is this woman, Rashasundari Devi, who secretly taught herself to write, simply putting the alphabets together by watching her sons were learning how to read and write. And she put the alphabets together and she secretly taught herself to write. Now, late in life, she wrote an autobiography of hers. Biographies and autobiographies were the staple of this new class, which has actually had a new self-image, and they are talking about their own personalities. And this woman, after her husband died, wrote this autobiography of hers where she describes her life. And she describes, again, using subjective experience as she's only talking about her life. And she's constantly fixing it with, my life is useless, I haven't done anything, but then she's also telling it nevertheless. There's all of that, but she's telling her story. And in the story of her life is this account not only of why she read, why she tried to teach herself how to read, but the fact that she was married, she's making it's a very conformist piece of work otherwise. But even in this conformist piece, there is a very interesting telling of the practices which make her understand the specific nature of women's lives, which is distinctive from that of the men. So she talks about how her mother was ill. She was not allowed to go and see her mother when her mother was dying. And she said her brother could go. And then she describes how she would be let, you see, her labor was so necessary to the running of that household. This is an upper class household. But nevertheless, her managerial labor was so necessary that when she went home to meet her mother, she had a letter, she calls it a letter of contract, which said, you have to come back in so many days, because that's all she can be sent off for. And she wasn't allowed to go when her mother died. So she actually talks about the difference between being a woman and a man. And she does the most amazing reversal of the term Kali Yuga. Kali Yuga has been the bane of Manu. It's been the bane of many, sort of hegemonic men. And she says, this blessed Kali Yuga, because women can be educated. So the 19th century for her is actually a reversal, because it gives women, the occasional woman, the possibility of being able to read and write. And she actually endorses that. Now, there's a lot of writing in the 19th century. On the whole, you'll find, and including from stage actresses, who were used on the stage, given us lot, who were very wealthy, but were betrayed by a series of people. So you have a range of autobiographies. Not all of them are critical of the institution. Some of them have difficulty naming the oppressor and naming the institutions that they have to that they are battling. But they do describe their own lives, and you can read that their lives are being, being shaped by a range of social institutions that exist in that society. On the whole, nevertheless, and some women find, subterranean ways of addressing issues. Like there's a good wife whose husband she writes to, and she starts the letter and she ends the letter with very conventional terminology. But in between, she kind of, when she gets to the middle part of it, she says, this is what you did. When I was 14, 15, you flung chairs at me. So she talks about domestic violence in the middle of this very conventional, my dear husband, I miss you, this, that, and the other, and then in between she's got this stuff. So it's a really amazing series of juxtapositions that she does. Nevertheless, on the whole, I think biographies and autobiographies were actually regarded as a fairly safe medium, because there wasn't too much. You couldn't really go hammer and tongs for social institutions. In fact, many men encouraged the writing of biographies and autobiographies because they wanted actually consent for the new patriarchies that were being constructed. So it was quite useful to have women write about the husbandly powers. Yeah. But, see, once you unleash something like the print medium, it's not going to be stuck necessarily to what men tell you what to do. And you may do it secretly, you may do it publicly. And you have, in Maharashtra in particular, you have this very fascinating series of materials. One of these figures I worked on, that's Pandita Ramabai. Now, Pandita Ramabai was a woman who had a conventional education, Sanskrit education. Later in her life, she went on to, she traveled because she was widowed and she wanted to open a home for widows. So she traveled abroad in search of funds. While she was away, she converted to Christianity, and she came back. While she was there, she actually wrote this text, which is called The High Caste Hindu Woman. Now, because she had a Sanskrit training, she actually was quite familiar with the textual model. She was familiar with even texts like Manu. And what she did was quite amazing. She modeled her own text in the same pattern, which is you start with the girl child, the birth of the child. That's the model that was used even in the canonical texts. The Manu follows that. It's the brahmacharya, then you go on to the householder, then you go on to the man who's on his way to renouncing the world. She used that life cycle pattern to now talk about the girl child, the married woman, the mother, and the widow. And as she proceeds, she kind of builds up the picture of oppression as it gets to different stages. And of course, the culmination is the widow. Now, here she does a very hard-hitting critique of patriarchy. This is a text of the kind that feminists would write. And she uses arguments which, we are using 150 years later. She talks about the differential birth rate, the fact that there are only so many girls to men, something that we've been looking at statistics all the time and saying only 900 to 1,000, only 870 to 1,000, that's an anxiety with us. She uses this argument, and the story that villagers tell is that hyenas have carried away the children. How they died, because this is during the British times, so you have to record how people have died. And she says, it's very strange that the hyenas only pick up girl children. Exactly the kind of argument we used when we had mother-in-laws burning their daughters-in-law. And we said, how is the stove so partial only to the daughter-in-law? How come it doesn't burst in the face of the mother-in-law? So, arguments of that kind which she uses. Now, there are other texts which are very hard-hitting critiques of patriarchy. They don't use the word patriarchy, but they're talking about the double standard of morality all the time. And the double standard of morality is one pretty good index. I mean, you could say it is the thing that you'll get before the second wave feminists, that is our generation. So you get all of this. Now, what is amazing is that there is this writing, people writing to the newspapers, talking about oppression. There are at least 3 or 4 that I found in Maharashtra. These women are not invited in any of the public debates that are taking place when the British are introducing reforms. So that's a very interesting scenario. Here are women talking about women's oppression, but they are not asked to come and give evidence before any commission. So there is a genderedness to even the colonial administrations talking to who they will talk to. And Pandita Ramabai points this out very effectively. She said, why should the British administration bother about the rights of women? They have a compact with the male population of India. Because, to rule, they know they need to have an alliance with the men of India. So, essentially, then there is this very hard-hitting critique. That was not visibilized in the same way the autobiographies were. And these are texts that the feminists now, in the post-70s and 80s, have had to. So, the archive has meant extracting this. They were published but then lost, and we had to then recover them and republish them because they're sources of history for their time, but they also tell you the histories of suppression. And very briefly, I'd like to say, just post 1950s, Dalit women, the lowest caste women who had access to education very, very late in life, they too are using the print medium now. They too are using their subjective experiences to talk about caste oppression and gender oppression simultaneously. And there's a very powerful statement that one of them makes, which space has been my own? In my house, male arrogance, the stinging of the cheek indicates male arrogance. When I go out into the street, the way in which I'm treated on the street shows you caste arrogance. So, writing is being used by women very powerfully. Now, I want to just end with one last point, and that is feminist scholars have been opened up, feminist historians have basically been doing something after something was already there. I mean, there was already a history and we had to add to it. The only field where we were pioneers was in the field of partition history. And here in Pakistan, Nigat has written, Samina Rahman has done literary criticism around partition stories, at least I've read one of them. In India, scholars have, and they're not formal historians, but they've written on the partition. For the first time, we actually were the pioneers of a field. And what is interesting is that once it became trendy, it was a field that was opened up, male historians have jumped into the field. And the important lesson that one learns out of that, and they get, because they're in universities, in public spaces, their work is getting noticed and being picked up. So essentially it's a question of originality, and theory has to be a monopoly of men. Now, the point that we need to end with is that Manu may not any longer be able to tell me, you can't write. But Manu's inheritors in terms of structures and institutions are still in place, which cannot exclude me maybe, but they can marginalize me, or they can marginalize the feminist historian or the feminist. And that really is the question. I mean, that is, how can we ensure that from exclusion we're not just moving to marginalization? How can we ensure that we are actually taken as seriously as other histories are not? That's really the question that I'd like to end with.